You may have noticed that we have not yet begun to talk about sexual orientation. That's where we will go now. Prior to the research conducted in the 1940s and 50s by Alfred Kinsey, sexual orientation was considered to be dichotomous. One was either heterosexual or homosexual. Kinsey, a biologist who taught at Indiana University, conducted groundbreaking sex research in which he and graduate students conducted thousands of interviews with adults, first males, then females, about their sexual feelings and behaviors. What they learned and published in the 1950s, no less, was that you could plot sexual behavior on a continuum, with 0 being attraction to the opposite sex and 6 being attraction to the same sex. And the result of their surveys and their interviews was a normal curve. So on this slide, you see the Kinsey scale. As I mentioned, what Kinsey's research showed was that they ended up with a normal curve, which I don't think is what most people would have expected. If in fact sexual orientation was really dichotomous, you would have ended up with a bimodal distribution. Instead, it's a normal curve, suggesting that most people, when they were asked and revealed their sexual histories, their sexual feelings, in fact came out in the middle of the scale. And that still is probably surprising to a lot of people, but in the 1940s and 1950s, it was revolutionary. I also want to mention that one of the statistics that many people are familiar with is that approximately 10% of the population is gay. And this really comes from the Kinsey statistics, and that has to do with people who came out as 5s and 6s on the Kinsey scale. It was approximately 10%. So Kinsey's research, as I said, was done with both men and women, but it was first with men, and that was published first, and then later with women. So now let's return to our paradigm. So sexual orientation, who I'm sexually attracted to. And I want to be clear that at this point, we're not talking about behavior. We're talking about feelings, right? Fantasies, dreams. So sexual orientation does not appear to be a choice. We really don't choose who we're attracted to, who we dream about. I want to point out also that one of the criticisms of Kinsey's scale is that it does not include asexuality, people who do not experience sexual feelings toward others, which more and more is an identifier that a number of our students are using for themselves. There are some more three-dimensional models which not only include asexuality but also break this up into things like romantic attraction, affectional attraction, and again, we're not going to go there now, but even though it seems like this is really being teased apart into many items, there's a lot more places that this could go. So now we're going to talk about sexual behavior. So unlike sexual orientation, sexual behavior is a choice, right? I choose who I'm going to become sexually involved with. So what's the relationship between sexual behavior and sexual orientation? As was the case with biological sex and gender identity, these are not always congruent. I want you to take a moment to think of an example in which someone whose primary sexual attractions are to people of the same sex, so that would mean maybe they're a 5 or a 6 on the Kinsey scale, yet they mostly engage in physical intimacy with people of the opposite sex. As you might imagine, this situation is not so unusual because of the bias and stigma in most cultures against same-sex relationship. Many people who wish to avoid stigma and be part of the dominant group will engage in opposite-sex relationships, even marriages, in their quest to be normal. That's in quotes. Some of the time this might be developmental or contextual. For example, young adulthood is often a time of experimentation, and In those parts of the world where public attitudes have become more positive toward LGBT individuals, there have been a lot more people coming out of the closet or never having been in the closet. Now take a moment and see if you can consider the opposite. That would be a situation where someone whose primary sexual attractions are to people of the opposite sex, yet they're engaging in same-sex behavior. This may be a little trickier to consider. Such behaviors are most common when same-sex relationships are the only options, and that would be in single-sex institutions, whether those are schools, prisons, or monasteries. One of the ways that people confuse sexual behavior and sexual orientation is that, for example, I'll have a student who comes in and who has a dream about someone of the same sex, or they experimented when they were a kid with someone of the same sex, and they want to know if that makes them gay. And so while there's a relationship, it's really not a one-on-one consistency in terms of our sexual orientation and our sexual behavior. One of the things that we have learned in the field is that sexual orientation appears to be a lot more fluid than we used to think. So the fact that someone identifies as heterosexual or identifies as gay or lesbian, it doesn't mean that that's the only only way they're going to identify their whole life. And if you go back to what I said about the Kinsey scale, since most people are really in the middle on the Kinsey scale, it's not a far place to go. Now, for those people who are really zeros and sixes, they're probably not going to have a whole lot of change over their lifetime in terms of their orientation. Again, I'm not talking at this point about their behavior, but their orientation. And now I also want to use some terminology. So for sexual orientation, we already have some terms up there. I want to say that we have the term straight. I know some people don't like that. So heterosexual is another term, lesbian and gay. Some people use the term queer to talk about their sexual orientation or their gender. I know there's many people, particularly people that are maybe more in my generation, who don't like the term queer because it has such a pejorative history. However, many people have essentially reclaimed the term, and people are probably aware that on lots of college campuses there are queer studies programs. Other terms, of course, could be asexual, bisexual, and pansexual. And pansexual is a term that's used by people who say that they are attracted basically to people who are just because they're people and not based on a particular biological sex, particular gender. They may be attracted to people who are cisgender. They may be attracted to people who are transgender. Sexual behavior, again, this isn't really very different in terms of how people might identify their behavior. And the next thing I want to bring in is one that is talked about much less, which is sexual orientation identity. And this is how I view my own sexual orientation. So, for example, there are, I'm going to use the example first of men who are primarily straight. So let's say they're on the Kinsey scale, they might be a 2 maybe, and yet their sexual behavior, they may engage in sexual behavior with the opposite sex, but they also may engage in same-sex behavior. And so from the outside, someone might look at them and say, well, they're bisexual, yet their orientation may be very clearly heterosexual. That's their identity. So it doesn't always have a one-on-one relationship. Another example would be someone whose sexual orientation is bisexual. So they're, attracted to men and women. Their sexual behavior, though, because of a long-term relationship. So let's say it's a woman and she's married to another woman, and she's monogamous, and so even though her orientation is bisexual, her identity might be lesbian. So it's just, to make things a little more complicated, I wanted to add that term. So now let's try to look at how all these various aspects of identity, including gender and sexuality, sexual orientation, how do they overlap and how do they end up getting all sort of smushed together? So let's talk about a situation of harassment where a truck drives by the campus and there's some guys in a truck and they scream out faggot or dyke at a student crossing the street. So what they're yelling are negative terms for words that describe one's sexual orientation. But in fact, they probably have no idea what the student's sexual orientation is, unless they saw, some public display of affection, for example. That might have given them a clue, or they might have made an assumption based on that. But let's say this is just a solo student crossing the street. So what is it that they're commenting on? Well, really, it's their gender role, right? That's what they're noticing. They're noticing somebody who appears to them to be a male and yet is either dressed as a female, or perhaps in the guys in the truck's opinion, the person is acting too feminine, or they see someone who they believe is a woman and who comes across as butch to them, whether it's the hair or whatever it is about her. So this is an example of how people mix all of this up. They make an assumption that because somebody's gender role does not conform to prescribed gender roles, to stereotypes, that therefore they must be gay or lesbian. And needless to say, these assumptions are not always correct. And I think that these assumptions, I know, are not just by people who are, for example, homophobic or who hate gay and lesbian people. I can't even tell you how many times I'm with friends and they see somebody and say, oh, they're like a part of the tribe or they're a family member. And what they're doing is they're doing the same thing. There is this tendency among many, progressive, well-meaning people to make assumptions about people's sexual orientation based on their gender role and expression. And I think that's unfortunate, because then we don't really get to know who this person is, or realize just how, whether you think of this as complicated or just rich, the diversity among people. Another assumption that I want to speak to is the notion that everyone who's transgender is gay or lesbian. And a key distinction here that I want to point out between gender and sexual orientation is that gender identity is really internal, right? This is about how the person feels about themselves and their own gender, whereas sexual orientation is more interpersonal. My experience has been working with a number of individuals who struggle with their gender identity is that it often takes them quite a while to even get to the question about who they're attracted to. Often there's so much personal work they have to do around figuring out their gender, that sexual orientation is just often not as primary for them. Finally, I want to briefly address some myths about bisexuality. The first is that a bisexual person is never satisfied unless they're in a relationship with both a man and a woman. The fact that bisexuals recognize their capacity to be attracted to people across the spectrum does not mean that they have to act on all their attractions. Next is the belief that bisexuality is not a real sexual orientation, but just one that an individual experiments with on their way to becoming or avoiding being gay or lesbian. Historically, bisexuals have been discriminated against by gays and lesbians for not making up their minds and for trying to have it both ways. And at the same time, they've often been discriminated against by the dominant heterosexual community for essentially being gay or lesbian. So This concludes the didactic portion. I thank you for sticking with it. And again, I really want to encourage you to bring questions. This was challenging to do for the online portion because typically the discussion that comes and the questions that come up really help with the explanations. So I do hope that you have written down some questions and that you bring them with you when you come to the face-to-face training.